My guest, Ashlee Culverhouse Cleveland, wears several hats. She is first a wife to her beloved Tom. She's an amazing mommy to Scout, who's the most beautiful little girl you'll ever see. Ashlee is the daughter to wonderful parents, Doug and Peggy Culverhouse. Doug spent his career as an anesthesiologist, mainly because his daddy told him he was going to be a doctor. His daddy had him pegged just right. And she's the sister to her best friend, Bailey, who will also be her lawyer if she ever needs one. Somewhere after all that, Ashlee is a professional photographer and has built an outstanding reputation in that field. Ashlee was also a granddaughter who paid special attention to her grandparents. And she's also a writer, and maybe as gifted as anyone I have ever read. In fact, I've read most everything she's ever posted. If she posts something, I read it. Pretty simple. Her writings about her beloved Culverhouse grandparents and their way of life simply tugs at my heartstrings. I knew I had to share Ashlee with my listeners. So get ready to have your heartstrings pulled. For some, she will remind you of a simpler time that is long gone, and of special people in your lives who taught you so much. Her comments will bring back memories of peace that have somehow given way to confusion and chaos. Others will be introduced to a time you have never experienced. All of you will meet Jack and Dorothy Culverhouse, who lived a simple life but made a profound impact on the people God had entrusted to them, and who both now are enjoying their eternal reward. You will notice that wisdom oozes from Ashlee's every pore because of the gift she received being a granddaughter to this remarkable couple. This is Ashlee's story. It's not a complicated story. In fact, she will take you back to a simpler time and place. It is the story of the greatest gift she received from her beloved grandparents. Simple wisdom. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom, and the one who gets understanding. For the gain from her is better than the gain from silver, and her profit better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand. In her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. Proverbs 3:13-18.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
This is Bruce Goddard, and you're listening to the View from a Hearse podcast. I have with me my friend Ashlee Culverhouse Cleveland. Ashlee, thank you for doing this for me. I know it's probably not on your top of the list of wanting to get on a podcast, but I know you've got a story that people would love hearing.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. I really, really appreciate it.
So what we're going to be talking about, whatever you want to talk about, but we certainly want to talk about your grandparents, and you spent a lot of time with your grandparents. Your granddaddy was especially special to you. I think they both were, but you write a lot about your grandfather. So let's start by just talking about the day he died. I think it was in a year and a half ago or so that he died, and I know it had a major impact on your life. So let's just start there.
Well, there was a pivotal moment that I remember realizing that this was the end. Granddaddy, to me, he was the type of person that I never thought about his death. Now, Minnie was sick with cancer for 20 years, so I had to face it daily. But Granddaddy, he was so strong and so prideful that I never really thought about him dying. And so there was a pivotal moment where Bailey, my sister, she and I met at their house to cook him dinner and to visit with him. And we get there, and he's in the bed, and it was probably 5:30 in the afternoon, and that was unheard of. And so we go back there to his bedroom, and I say, "Granddaddy, what are you doing in the bed?" He looks up at me and he says, "I'm just no good anymore."
He was 97 years old, right?
He was 97, yes, sir, yeah. And Bailey, my sister, she's a lawyer. She's more polished than I am, and she spoke for us, and she said, "Granddaddy, that's not what we think." But that was one of the first times of my life that the breath had been taken out of me from a moment being so painful. So he died on a Tuesday in November, and it was just over 9 months, almost to the day, of Ninny passing away. And with Ninny, we had several months to process the end with Ninny, but with Granddaddy, it was just about 2 weeks, I believe. Selfishly, that was hard for me. I felt like my heart needed more time to prepare for that. But for him, that was what was ideal, because he was such a prideful man. In fact, if I had to sum him up in one word, it would be prideful. He didn't let you see any type of weakness.
He was prideful and meek at the same time, yes, I think you would say.
And very humble, humble.
Did you think that when your grandmother died, what do you call it, Ninny?
Ninny.
Mm-hmm. He probably kind of gave up then, right?
To be honest with you, his existence after losing Ninny, it was hard to watch. I felt like he was waiting to die. He stopped doing the things that he had done every day. He stopped feeding the fish every day at 3:30. He wore bedroom shoes around. He didn't plant a single thing in the garden. And honestly, I think he thought his life purpose had been fulfilled. He took care of her for almost 20 years. And so I feel like he was ready to be reunited with her. And
my dad did exactly the same thing. Daddy died 5 months to the day after Mama. And when Mama died, he quit living. He never turned the coffee pot on again. I mean, he never did anything. Yeah. He used to cook. He never did any of that. And you would
like a light had been blown out, honestly. Right. And losing Ninny and Granddaddy was really the first time I'd been confronted with a death on a close personal level. I've lost people I'd loved before, but no one that close to me. And not to be morbid, but as painful as it was, their death was a beautiful thing, because it was 2 lives well lived. They were well respected. They were deeply loved by their family. And we really just came together as a family and faced something that we feared, even though it broke our hearts to do so. We just faced it head on. And all those boundaries that you have as you grow up, like I would just climb into the bed with Ninny as she was sick and just lay beside her, and we'd play her hymns. And I hadn't done that in years. And you couldn't have asked for 2 lives more well-lived than theirs, in my opinion. Yeah. And they were both they both died at home. They were both with family, peacefully. And there was something very dignifying to that. And it changed me in a lot of ways to witness a death, and it showed me what matters at the end of someone's life.
Isn't it truth? And it's great that you can sit here and honor them today. His name was Edward Douglas Culverhouse, but they called him Jack. Talk about that. How did he get the name Jack?
Nobody knew him as Edward Douglas Culverhouse. They nicknamed him Jack because of the boxer Jack Dempsey. Granddaddy was tiny. I think he was 5'5". And apparently people would fight for fun back then, and they say he was unbeatable in a boxing match. And so as tiny as he was tough as nails. And I really think his ability to endure pain is likely why he was so good at boxing, because he was just tough. And what's interesting about Granddaddy is doctors told him he was going to live to maybe 35 or 40. They said he had a heart condition. And while he did have heart problems, but nothing that concerned us too bad. I don't know if the doctors were just wrong or he was that tough or what.
Let's talk about how he made a living. And he did well, by the way, folks. He did very well making a living. He lived a simple life, but differently than most people today. You would never know it if you pulled up at their house, right, Ashlee?
Right, yeah. It's very simple, very modest, very small. So Granddaddy built houses for a living. Now, their house was, from the outside, nothing special, but that's what he did. He built houses for a living, and he told me shortly before he died, he built for $6 a square foot. So I know, well, Tom and I just got done building a house, and that number makes me sick, to be honest with you. It's out of control. But Granddaddy built for $6 a square foot, and he was the best around.
He had a waiting list of people waiting on him to build their house, right?
Probably, yeah, probably. When we're in Butler or Taylor County, Dad will point out houses he built to me, and I always think to myself, gosh, I wonder if the people inside know that they're living in a house that was built by the greatest man to ever live, in my opinion. But my dad actually worked with Granddaddy as a child and teenager, and Dad told me that Granddaddy would always, if there was a ditch to be dug, Granddaddy would make him do it. He always gave him the absolute worst jobs, and Dad thinks it was to discourage him from wanting to do that as a living. The interesting thing about Granddaddy building the houses too, though, is he built them. It wasn't like he was a contractor. He actually built the house, and the only thing he contracted out was the plumbing, heating and air. There was one more. I think it was electrical, and that was it.
Your dad, who is obviously your granddad's son, he put him through all the tough stuff and made him do the hard stuff. But in all of that, he became a medical doctor. He's an anesthesiologist, I guess retired now. But just incredible. There's a lesson there, I think, Ashlee. That's a lesson.
Yeah.
Your dad worked coming up, lived a very simple life, but did very well. And I know your dad gives a lot of credit to his parents of the success that he's had, for sure.
Yeah, they were tough on him, but not in a bad sort of way. Right. They just expected a lot out of him. Dad has told me, Granddaddy said, you're going to be a doctor. It was what it was. And Dad was very good at that. It almost seemed to be his calling, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah.
Dad had a great bedside manner and is very calm under pressure. So
sure.
I think Granddaddy was onto something. Granddaddy probably saw that in him, maybe.
Yeah. So he also farmed too, right?
He did for just for a handful of years. He farmed on halves with a neighbor, stuff like row crops, peanuts, corn, soybeans. He did a lot of watermelons. But by the time I came along, when I knew him, he just farmed for our food, and he would plant entire fields of food for we didn't have a big family. Right. He would plant the entire field, Culverhouse peas and watermelons, cantaloupes, corn, sweet potatoes, and we'd make an entire day out of digging the sweet potatoes, the whole family. Granddaddy would drive the tractor, and he'd harrow them up, and Mom and Dad and Bailey and I would pick them up and load them into the bushels. And I always wanted the job of driving the truck while they dug and loaded. And now, I look back on that, and I'd give anything to go back with the heart that I have now. Back then it was a chore.
Right.
And
right.
He got me to make a sign one year, and we put it by the road, and he would sell the bushels of sweet potatoes. And if you visited their house, you were not leaving without something from the garden. That was a way he showed his love, was sharing the food that he grew. So
he made a living building houses. He grew all your food that you ate, right? Just about all of it that you ate. Were you guys living out there then?
No, so Dad, he had to live, I think it was within 10 to 15 miles of the hospital, because obviously he took call.
Right.
So every single weekend, Friday afternoon, we would load up into my dad's Ford Ranger and go to Butler. That's where we would go. So we spent every weekend with them at their house. And then in 2007, Mom and Dad built a cabin out there, but really my entire childhood, we stayed with them every single weekend, every holiday. Every bit of spare time was spent at their house.
Is their house still there?
It is, yeah. It is. It's still there.
So I bet it makes you swallow hard to walk in there, right?
Woo, yeah, it does. I thought that I wouldn't be able to go back very much after losing them. And now, don't get me wrong, It's painful in some ways, but pain's not always bad. You know,
Right.
sometimes there's a memory in every square inch of that house for me.
Yeah.
I can look at any part of that house and I can tell you a memory from that part of the house.
You know, the pain moves to smiles as time goes on. That is for sure.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
It really does. And,
Yeah.
you know, grief, it comes in waves. You know, I'll be walking around the grocery store just fine. And then, you know, I'll see something that makes me think of Ninny and I'll cry, but not a bad cry, almost like a cleansing cry and a cry of gratitude because I have someone to cry over.
So you watched them closely. I can tell that by your writings. And one of the things that you loved about your grandfather, and I guess the stability of it, was his habits that you saw him, you know, do just about every day. It makes you smile today. Most people today's life is not consistent of many habits because things change so much. You're in and out. But these folks were just there, and you saw stuff that he did every single day that you never forgot, right?
You're right. Yeah. He began each day exactly the same. From my bed, I could hear the hum of his electric razor in the hall bathroom. Then he'd migrate to the kitchen, and every single day of my life, now he may have eaten something different before, but of my life, every single morning he ate cornflakes and drank coffee. And by the time I'd get up, he'd usually be back in the house because he'd get up. If I were there, he would get up early and get his chores done so he could devote time to me. Granddaddy only sat down to read the paper and to eat. That was it. I never saw him sit down other than to read the paper and to eat. And every day the Macon Telegraph would be delivered at 2:33 p.m. and he would read every word of it. And then he'd close it and he'd say, "Wasn't nothing to that." but he read it cover to cover every
Isn't that
day.
amazing? Who does that now? Not many.
I know, not many.
Think of the knowledge he had of what was going on in the world and what was going on in Middle Georgia and all that. That's incredible.
And every day around 3 p.m., that was kind of our snack time. He would drink a Dr. Pepper every day around 3. And even now, I can take a sip of a Dr. Pepper, and every time I do, for that first sip, I'll close my eyes, and I can transport myself to their kitchen. I mean, it's like time traveling. And then at 4 to 4:30 every day, he'd get in his pickup and drive to the pond and feed the fish. And he had practically tamed those fish. You almost didn't even have to bait your hook to catch a fish in that pond. And the fish, when they would hear his pickup coming down a little path, they would start waving the water because they knew they were about to get fed. Ninny and Granddaddy, they ate, it's lunch, but they called it dinner. So they ate dinner at 11:30. And they ate supper at 5 o'clock. And then after supper, he'd go into the living room and just blare the 6 o'clock news on the TV. And that was the only news we got was the 6 o'clock news. There weren't the 24-hour news networks like there are now.
He was a creature of habit. Wow.
Yeah, he was. Ninny was too, really, on Friday mornings. That's when we would do our grocery shopping. And Granddaddy was kind of odd. He didn't like to go inside unless he had to. So he'd open the windows of the car. If it was nice weather, he would prop up on the hood, and I would stay with him. And that was back when they had a drink machine in the front. And if I was with him, we'd get a knee high and we'd split it. And
I can just see that. I've forgotten. I've had images. We used to have a grocery store, and I remember some of the men sitting out leaning on the hood of the car while their wife was shopping.
Yeah. I never even questioned why Granddaddy didn't go in. It's just Granddaddy didn't go in.
That's great. So you're talking about your grandparents. They were, in a lot of ways, opposite from each other, but they had a great relationship. Talk about what you saw with them.
Ninny was warm, and she loved birds. She loved babies. She loved flowers, the color blue. She smelled like Norman powder. She was so feminine despite being tough, and living in the country. She was just delicate and, I don't know, such a source of comfort for me. And Granddaddy, he was more stoic, but he certainly softened when I came along. And, I would see them nitpick at each other. They were always, I don't know, just nitpicking at each other. But I never once saw them fight. Now, Mom and Dad, I did ask them, I said, did Nenny and Granddaddy ever fight? And they both laughed and said, yes. But by the time I came along, I never witnessed any type of true scuffle. And Nenny was just she was selfless. And sometimes, when I feel annoyed by something Tom's doing or I have to do something for Tom, I'll think to myself, be more like Nenny, because Nenny would pack Granddaddy's lunch and she would cook for him and she would beat the dirt out of his overalls. And I never heard her one time complain about that. And Granddaddy, he didn't show his love in a physical way. Like I never saw them hug or kiss or hold hands. But as Nenny's health began to decline from the cancer, he took over every single household duty, the cooking, the cleaning, and he never complained either. He really took care of her in a strong, silent way. And to me, that shows his heart for her.
Folks, we're talking to Ashlee Cleveland. She's talking about her incredible grandparents, and there are huge lessons here. The way people lived and the lessons one learns from watching the way somebody lives up close. And Ashlee had a front row seat watching her grandparents. Ashlee, by the way, is a photographer by profession and a very good one.
Sometimes I would just drive over to Butler just to follow him around with a camera.
Yeah, and so talk about that. Talk about his appearance. I've read some of what you've written, that obviously he was outside, he was tan. You would zoom in on the lines on his face and what he wore every day and all that. Just talk about that. Just talk about your grandfather's appearance to you and what you saw.
Well, Granddaddy wore pinstripe black and white overalls 6 days a week. That he was just kind of known for that. I never saw him in anything other than that. Other than on Sundays, he wore khakis and a button down. And Nenny would lay his clothes out every night before, and on Saturday night, she would let me pick what shirt he was going to wear the next day. And I used to get the biggest kick out of that. For years, he wore caps, and then he went through a long stint where he wore what's called a pith helmet, and it's literally just like a safari helmet. And he wore that for years. And we used to get a kick out of it because he looked funny, but not just, especially for a farmer to be going around in a safari hat, he looked funny. He was tan, very tan. He had dark skin from working in the sun. But when you'd see his legs, if he'd pull up his pants leg to like shine his shoes or something, his legs were like almost see-through because they never saw the sun. They were so white.
That's called a farmer's tan, right?
Yes, yeah, he very much had a farmer's tan for sure. Yeah. It was a vast difference in the color of his legs and the color of his arms. If
you open his closet, you would not find many clothes in there. If he wore pinstripe overalls, what do you have, 3 or 4 pairs of those, or do he have a lot of them? Or
he had more than you think. The reason he had more than you think is because everything that Dad outgrew or didn't want anymore, he would pass down to Granddaddy. So it's not like Granddaddy was going out buying these clothes, really, but Granddaddy had more in his closet than you would think. But, we would try to buy him new overalls without the paint on them and without the holes. And, he'd thank us when he unwrapped them, and then he'd just put them in the spare bedroom back there and never really get into them. He really just preferred his old, very worn overalls.
Why was he your favorite person to photograph?
He was just the most handsome man I'd ever seen. He was so, for lack of a better word, he was so cool without trying to be. The hats he wore, his style, the overalls, the boots, he was just so cool to me. And then, as he aged, his eyes just got even kinder. He had the kindest eyes I've ever seen when he truly smiled. Right. And I felt like the best way I knew how to capture him was with a camera. And I think I also felt somewhere in me that it was important to photograph him. I knew he was different, and I knew he was special, and I knew that the type of man he was unique and something that was becoming harder and harder to find as I aged. And I really felt a sense of duty to document him just doing the most mundane of tasks. I mean, I One time he got the mail every day. So I followed him to the mailbox. He fed the fish every day. So I followed him to the pond and just documented him doing what was so normal for him because I felt like I needed to.
You know, what was so normal for him, but now looking back is so meaningful to you and Bailey and your whole family.
You're right.
It's very, very meaningful now. And boy, that's another lesson. We missed that stuff that we don't realize. You were documenting. You were smart to document what you were seeing, and that is a treasure for you and your family. But a lot of people miss that. You wish you had. Another thing you mentioned is his eyes. I've written several times about my mother's eyes. I never really thought about it growing up, but those eyes I looked into all my life. They were the most familiar eyes I'd ever known, and I didn't realize it until she died, really how familiar her eyes was. And that's another whole story. So it's interesting that you mentioned that you were seeing his eyes and looking into his eyes, and wow, another lesson. So the other thing you said, he wore his overalls 6 days a week, but on Sunday he changed clothes and wore a button-down shirt and khaki pants. So let's talk about his Sundays. Talk about what he did. He believed in keeping the Sabbath, right?
He did. What's interesting is Granddaddy did not go to church with us. Now, Nenny was very active in the church, and Granddaddy stayed at home. Honestly, now that I'm older, I think Granddaddy was very nervous away from their house and away from their property. And I almost feel like he had maybe a social anxiety away from their home. Because you got to think their house that they lived in, as the crow flies, it was maybe 2 miles from his home place. Like he didn't get far from home very often. When we did leave the county for whatever reason, he didn't enjoy himself. It was very clear. He wanted to be at home where he was most comfortable. So he did not go to church with us, but he very much honored the Sabbath. We could not fish on Sundays. And I don't know if that's just an older rule. It was just understood we didn't fish on Sundays.
Yeah, well, I grew up the same way for years. My mother, I couldn't even go swimming on Sunday. And I remember looking at people put in pools. I'd look out the window and watch people swimming. I was thinking, what in the world could be sinful about that?
When Tom mentions going fishing on a Sunday, I'm kind of still at 33. I'm like, ooh, I don't think we're supposed to. The more I've thought about it, I think his church was where he was comfortable. I think he worshiped probably out in the fields on his tractor or in a turkey blind built out of sticks, or early in the morning when it was just him eating his cornflakes. He was a Christian. He believed in God. And he certainly lived in a way to me that reflected that. And he treated the Sabbath as it was intended to be treated. We didn't fish. We didn't do anything. We really kind of sat there and passed around the newspaper, and we shelled a lot of peas on Sunday.
But those were great memories too, right? Just sitting around doing anything.
Yeah.
That was a day of rest.
Yeah, for sure.
So you mentioned his toughness and his ability to endure trials.
Well, first of all, being told he was going to die young, if a doctor told me I was going to die at 35, I think I'd just roll over. I would just say no. He just kept going. He had back surgery in the 60s, and what I'm going to say, he went back to work before the doctor cleared him to do so. Nenny was diagnosed with cancer in the early 2000s. It was the early 2000s, and he took on her chores and the cooking, the cleaning, and he did it without complaining. He had prostate cancer in the early 2000s, and if I wouldn't have even known it. It didn't slow him down at all. He just kept going. Right. So back to what we were talking about, the first time I ever saw him falter was after Nenny died. Any hardship that came his way, he just faced it head on. He went right through it. But Nenny's death was different. You
got so many memories. You've written about his homemade cornbread. You talked about his Dr. Peppers. He loved coconut cake and almond joys. He loved coconut, period, it sounds like. You got memories of his pocket watch he carried in his front pocket.
Well, another way Granddaddy showed his love was with his cornbread. And he was he was proud of that. He was, that's another thing that visitors to their house would get sent home with, was their cornbread. And his was just so savory. It was crunchy on the outside and just the perfect consistency on the inside. And so I knew that was important. So I photographed him making his cornbread. He would whip it up in a old Cool Whip container.
Right.
I photographed it and I wrote down the steps. Of course, he wouldn't give me exact measurements because he didn't know them.
Right.
I was like, Granddaddy, how much of this do you put in? He's like, well, just a tad. So anyway, we've tried to replicate it, and Mom does pretty good. And my husband, Tom, he's gotten the closest, but nobody's nailed it. And both Ninny and Granddaddy were obsessed with tomatoes. You've never seen two people eat more tomatoes in your life. And we were talking about it this weekend, something that I had forgotten. Granddaddy would peel the tomatoes, and he was so slow at peeling the tomatoes. We'd be sitting around the table ready to eat, and he'd be over there peeling the tomatoes. It would truly take him about 20 minutes, and we'd just be sitting around like tapping our foot ready to eat. He loved Almond Joys, and then he kept a stash of Almond Joys for him. And for each holiday, he was so hard to buy for because he didn't want anything. So we'd always get a pack of Almond Joys from Sam's for him. And he was very thin, and now Ninny was overweight. And we got the biggest kick because Dad would Ninny was borderline diabetic, and so Dad would really kind of get on her case about eating sweets. And she would tell us, now she was being serious, she'd be like, Jack ate all the Little Debbies, or Jack was the one that ate this. She would blame everything on Jack, and it was very clear that Jack wasn't the one eating all the Little Debbies. Mom brought this up the other day. We should all eat like Granddaddy ate, because he would pile his plate just full of vegetables and just very little meat. And aside from his 3 o'clock Dr. Pepper, he only drank water. Yeah.
So he obviously grew up in a depression, and as most people that grew up in that time, I probably explained some of the ways he was frugal in what he did when you were growing up there. And I'm sure as a kid you saw people that had bigger houses and more elaborate houses, and you saw their simple house, and you probably didn't realize at that point they could have built any house they wanted, but they chose never to do that. I'm sure he never owed a dime to anybody in his life. Talk about those lessons that you saw, just the way they lived their life there, the simple way, and the impact of that.
I think once I was old enough to understand the concept of money, I think I just assumed that they were poor because they lived in such a small house and they lived so simply. When I was young, I didn't think that much about money. But then it wasn't until my late 20s that I started to realize that just because they didn't spend it didn't mean they didn't have it. They did not own a credit or debit card. That was unheard of. And everything was paid for in cash. Wow. We clipped coupons every Sunday. We ate from the garden, like I said, but we always had plenty. And
he had hand-me-down clothes from your dad. Oh,
yeah. It was very rare for them to wear new clothes. They were resourceful. I mean, everything had a purpose. Coffee grounds, we threw those and eggshells into the garden. It did something for the flowers, apparently. I'm not sure what, but I knew that when we cooked eggs in the morning, that they were getting thrown out into the garden.
Do you realize how much the world has changed since people live like that? I mean, just think about, my goodness, what would this country be if everybody lived that kind of life within their means, and not trying to impress other people? That was obviously way down on their list of who they were trying to impress that week, I can promise you.
They didn't throw anything away. They would just find an alternate use for it. Like if we had an appliance, there was no central AC. So the appliances that we did have, they were literally used until they started smoking. It became a fire hazard. Like the appliance would really have to be cutting up for them to get rid of it. And even then, they just place it in an outbuilding and use it for parts. And we slept with our windows open, and we just sweated it out. We had a box fan propped in the window, and they would catch rainwater in plastic tubs to water the flowers with when it got dry. And I was going through some of Minnie's Christmas decorations recently, and I found she had spray painted some sweet gum balls and hung them on her tree, I guess, because they had little hooks on them. And I took a couple of them kind of as a reminder of she just made do. She just made do, and I never, ever, ever heard either one of them say, I want this or I want that.
Right. But what they did do was they spent a lot of time with y'all, and you got all these memories of driving on the truck tailgate and fishing and in the John boat, and he taught you how to shoot a gun and peeling peaches and all what you talked about, digging vegetables out there and hauling trash off. Just talk about a little bit of that whole time, that's the investment he made in you. And Bailey, too, as a kid, just talk about that and the fun times you had there.
When we were there, we were really the center of their world. A lot of the things we did together, we hunted broken glass in the fields that surrounded the house. We looked for Indian rocks. One of my favorite things to do, we would go to an old trash pile. People would just dump their trash by the side of the road, I guess in the 70s and 80s, and we would go and dig up old glass bottles out of the trash piles. And that was just, I still have the bottles too. We had a good time doing that. We walked in the woods. We would just set off and walk in the woods, and for what seemed like miles. We picked scupnins right off the vine and ate until our bellies hurt. He built me a swing one year out of just a board and hung it from an oak tree, and we'd stay out there for hours. We fished a lot, hauling off the trash. They didn't have garbage trucks that came around. We would haul off the trash, and that was a huge adventure to me. He taught me to drive, so I would sit on one of my dad's old medical school books, and he taught me how to drive in the field beside the house. He also taught me how to shoot with a Clorox bottle as my target. Granddaddy's marksmanship, it felt like to me a God-given skill. And one of my favorite memories of him displaying that, really, this has been probably 7 years ago probably. And Tom and I were out riding four-wheelers, and we came across a moccasin in the ditch, and we weren't far from the house. So I said, let's go get Granddaddy to kill it. And so we go get Granddaddy, and by that time, he's hard of hearing, he can't see very well. And so I said, Granddaddy, there's a snake. Well, he gets up, he goes and gets his gun, and we drive him to where the snake is, and Tom's trying to show him the snake, and I can tell Granddaddy can't see where it is. And so Tom keeps pointing, and Granddaddy's not seeing it. And I was sitting there thinking, like, Lord, please, I don't want to see him lose this gift that he's always been so good at in a very humble way. I don't want to see that taken away from him. And so all of a sudden, I'm watching his face, and I see this look of recognition spread across it. He pulled the trigger, and the snake just virtually blew in two. And Tom was so impressed. Tom was like, you got him. And Granddaddy had already turned and was walking back towards the truck, and he chuckled and he said, I believe I did. I don't know. He was just so cool. And that scene reminds me from To Kill a Mockingbird, how Atticus shoots the rabid dog, and how his gift of marksmanship was bestowed on him, and it wasn't something he used unless he had to. But Granddaddy, it was incredible to watch. He would pull both triggers of a double-barreled shotgun in his boxer shorts, holding the flashlight, and he'd just splatter an armadillo clear across the yard. There wouldn't be anything left to dispose of. But I felt like he didn't even have to aim, really. It was a God-given skill, and we loved to turkey hunt together, and we'd get up in the stand, and he'd hold on to the back of my coveralls because I was notorious for going to sleep. So that was something we enjoyed doing together. So
he also taught you another lesson about silence. So he could be silent for a while. So talk about that a little bit. Boy, that's an interesting concept today.
Well, this is something that will be hard to believe, but he was struck by lightning twice. So the first time was before my dad was born. The lightning, he was climbing over a fence, and lightning hit the fence he was climbing over. And the only thing that happened, he was wearing boots that had tacks in the bottom of them, and where his feet were burned where the tacks were in his boots. So then again, in 1980, my dad was about to go pick my mom up for a date, actually. And Dad couldn't leave because the weather was so bad. And lightning came through the phone line, and Granddaddy was sitting in his rocking chair next to it. And it knocked him into the middle of the floor. And Dad said he was out for a few seconds. And so needless to say, his hearing after that wasn't great. And so he did wear hearing aids for a number of years. And then I think he just got one ear infection from being out in the fields with his hearing aids and sweating. And he got an ear infection, and he would not put those hearing aids back in. That's the thing about Culverhouses, they're stubborn. I am probably the king of the stubborn people. So he became very good at reading lips, but I'll say it inhibited the way we were able to communicate because it was exhausting to scream. So he did it became harder to communicate with him as his hearing got even worse.
So you also have this mental picture that many of us have when we lose a loved one of them waving, coming out and waving goodbye when you were leaving. It's amazing how you remember that.
I would dread Sunday evenings like the plague. I guess they call that the Sunday scaries now. I had a big case of it because that meant that we would have to pack up and leave and go back home to Warner Robins, and I didn't want to do that. Every Sunday evening when we would leave, they would both come outside on the porch and see us off, and their house is on a hill, and so as you turn left out of the drive and go down the bank, we just had this tradition of blowing the horn twice, and they would not go back in the house. Now, Nini stopped doing it as she became less and less mobile, but Granddaddy never stopped doing that, standing on the porch and waving at us until we were totally out of sight. And I took a photo of him doing that one time, just because it was such I just knew that was important too.
You know, it's amazing the memories that become important. And that's one of them, right? Just that mental picture. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things you write about is, and I wholeheartedly agree with you, that this simple way of life that they lived out on that farm is very difficult to do these days. Why is that? Why do you think it's more difficult to live the way they lived?
Well, I can remember the very first time I wrote about them, and it was kind of sparked by that. I think it was probably about 12 years ago. And at the time, I was building my business. I was working around the clock, doing 7-8 shoots a week, and then a wedding or two every weekend. I felt exhausted. I felt burnt out. And one day, I just remember being in total meltdown mode. And so I ran away, and I ran to Nini and Granddaddy's house. And I walked in, and Nini's in her chair, and she's barefoot, and she's in her sundress, and she's got a big bucket of peas in her lap, and she's just shelling peas. And so I sit down next to her, and I started shelling too, and I spent the entire afternoon with them, ate supper with them. I didn't answer my phone. I didn't respond to texts. And that day I realized that something that had been so, annoying, something that I complained about doing as a child, I didn't want to shell peas. That at that age, that's what I long to do now. It had become a luxury for me in the fast-paced world I was living. And so when I got home, I wrote about it. I just had this spark of thought in my brain, and so I wrote it all down and I posted it. I had a site that I didn't think anybody read, and so I just posted it on there, and I went about my business. And a lot of people commented and texted about it and about how much it resonated with them. And I was like, gosh, we're all just longing for more simplicity. I think I can only speak for myself, but I really think that a lot of other people struggle with this too. The level of connectivity we have, because it can be a good thing, but at any given moment, we're reachable by Facebook message. We're reachable by text message. We can receive a phone call, direct message on Instagram, a world of other apps I'm too old to even know about. So at any given moment, the entire world's trying to get in touch with you. And for me, that can send me just into a state of total overwhelm, for lack of a better term. And so I know for my own mental health, I keep my phone on Do Not Disturb quite a bit, because just so I can focus and just so I can give my best to Scout.
You learned that from them. And it's hard to do, to cut yourself off from everybody, but it sure gives you a peace of mind.
We didn't pay attention to what other people had because we didn't know what other people had, you know?
That's true.
Sometimes the less you know about what's going on around you, the happier you are. We just didn't know as much about people back then. We didn't know what their opinions were, or...
And you didn't care either, right?
You just didn't care. You didn't care.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned this Scout. You and Tom have I'm telling you, folks, it's the most gorgeous little girl you've ever seen in your life. Her name is Scout. And so I know that when you think about, you write about your grandparents and you're raising this little girl, I'm sure you're trying to figure out how to connect those dots and make sure that she understands some of the wisdom that you got from God through your grandparents, right?
Well, so what's so special about Scout, I found out I was pregnant with her 1 week to the hour of Granddaddy passing away. She was a total surprise. And I really believe with all my heart they sent her to me. There's not a day that passes that I don't talk to her about them. And she's only 8 months old. She doesn't understand, but I talk to her like she's 25 and a girlfriend of mine, you know. If we're outside and I hear a bobwhite, I tell her, you know, I used to hear those at Nanny and Granddaddy's house. And same with a whippoorwill. I can close my eyes when I hear a whippoorwill and I'm back in my bedroom in their house. And so if I see a hummingbird, I tell her, you know, Nanny loved hummingbirds. If I put her in something that's blue, I tell her, Nanny and I shared a love of blue. You're going to love the color blue too. I have a bear that's made out of Granddaddy's overalls, and it's on her bed. And every day she reaches for that bear. I'm like, that's Granddaddy's overalls, and they have paint on them because he worked so hard. The other day, the news played a segment of The Young and the Restless. Something was happening with The Young and the Restless, and the opening notes to The Young and the Restless came on. And so I started crying, and I could tell Scout was looking at me like, Mama, are you all right? She was eyeing me.
Yeah.
And so I said, Minnie, watch that every day, and it makes me miss her. And so I tell Scout all the time how much they would have adored her had they gotten to see her here on Earth. And she doesn't understand now, but she will. She will if I continue to do that. And just talking about them, writing about them, it's helped to heal me.
The world changes, but the wisdom you learn from them does not change. It's everlasting, and you keep doing what you're doing, and you not only are you passing it to Scout, but in your writing, and you mentioned the website you wrote on. I was reading it. There's got to be a book in here about this. I mean, you're such a talented writer. I don't know what your aspirations are. It's hard when you're working, you're raising a child, and all you guys are doing, I understand, but at some point there's a book, but keep passing that wisdom down. She will be better for it. I guarantee you that. When it's all said and done, what are the greatest things you learn from them that you would share with the rest of us?
Granddaddy, both of them, Nitty and Granddaddy, they taught me the gift of time, taking up time with a child. They didn't buy us the most expensive toys on the market. They didn't spoil us monetarily at all. But when we were there, we were the center of their world, and all the simple things that we did together, that's what has stuck with me. That's what means the most to me. I knew I was loved. I never questioned it. My life with them, though I didn't know it at the time, it was giving me the foundation to treasure those simple things. And I couldn't think of a more appropriate time to really hone in on the simple enjoyments and really focus on the simple things of life, because we need more of that today. Granddaddy taught me loyalty. He showed, like I said, he showed his love in a quieter way. But I remember as Nene lay dying, Granddaddy walked out to her camellia bush. I'd never seen him do anything like this before. But he walked out and he picked her a camellia off the bush and he put it by her bedside. And another thing Granddaddy taught me, he taught me to stay active. I sit down to work on my computer, obviously, but otherwise I keep moving. Scout and I walk all day long. I watched him thrive just from continuing to move. And I want to live to 98, you know?
Sure.
And I think the secret is staying active and maybe a Dr. Pepper or two every now and then.
At 3 o'clock.
Yeah, at 3 o'clock. Yeah, it only works at 3 o'clock. Death, I think it can either harden or soften you. And now, their death, obviously, I knew that I was going to have to face it one day if the natural progression of life went as it was supposed to. I knew that I was going to have to face their death. But it softened me in a lot of ways, and it made me realize that life, it's going to come at you in waves. Some weeks, months, years, you'll be at the top of that wave. And then sometimes you'll be at the bottom between crest. And losing both of them in the same year, along with the pandemic and a few other things, I reached rock bottom of that. I mean, my heart was so empty. And I filled my calendar with work around the clock because I didn't want to feel anything. I just worked all the time. And then 1 week after Granddaddy died, finding out I was pregnant, that wasn't my plan. I was so overwhelmed, and I just remember thinking, God, this is too much. I can't do this. And it took me a few weeks, but my heart really, really, really began to change. And I began to view it as me having the opportunity to continue a legacy, really, that started with them. And in their death, I felt as though they restored my purpose that I'd lost. Living in a way that honors them and being the type of parent I know that would make them proud, that has done wonders for my grief. And I was going through a box. Nene used to just clip. If she liked it, she clipped it out with scissors and she put it in a box. And I was going through recipes the other day, and I found this clipping, and it wasn't a recipe, and I read it, and it's short, and it says, after the clouds, the sunshine, after the winter, the spring, after the shower, the rainbow, for life is a changeable thing. After the night, the morning, bidding all darkness cease, after life's cares and sorrows, the comfort of sweetness and peace. I looked at that as, I feel like they do communicate with me just in different ways. And I took that home and I put it in a picture with Scout.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.